There comes a moment in the inner life when what once inflamed you, what once tangled your nerves and compelled your words now passes before you like a shadow on a wall. You watch it, it moves, but it does not move you. You see it clearly now, not because the world has changed, but because you have. This is not indifference. It is not cruelty or repression. It is what the soul feels when it has outgrown the drama of ego-bound entanglements. For a time you may have taken the stillness for emptiness, but it is not the emptiness of loss. It is the space that truth creates when illusion falls away. The characters in the old play still recite their lines, still gesture toward you with old provocations, but the script no longer binds you. You no longer need the applause or the argument. Emotional detachment, when viewed through the lens of deep psychological work, is often misunderstood. Many interpret it as coldness, numbness, or a sign that something has gone wrong internally, but in reality, emotional detachment can be a profound sign of growth, of psychic differentiation. When an individual begins to psychologically separate from the patterns, projections, and unconscious behaviors of others, a natural shift occurs in their emotional responsive. The things that once evoked powerful reactions, whether anger, sadness, guilt, or anxiety, gradually lose their grip. This does not happen through repression or suppression, but rather through the organic process of integration. As parts of the psyche are seen, acknowledged, and reconciled within, the external world begins to reflect less chaos and more distance. The soul no longer resonates with frequencies it has matured beyond. In relationships, especially those rooted in unhealed dynamics or unconscious projections, there is often a deep fusion of emotional states. One person's turmoil becomes the other's urgency. The emotional boundary between self and other is thin or non existent, and so the individual feels constantly affected, pulled, entangled in dramas not entirely their own. But as the inner work unfolds, the psyche begins to differentiate. It starts to see where it ends and the other begins. And in that realization, a form of detachment arises, not as an act of rejection, but as a byproduct of clarity. You begin to realize that not every emotional wave is yours to surf. Not every crisis demands your engagement. Not every raised voice or cold silence carries a message meant for your spirit. This form of detachment is not born from superiority or escape, but from having wrestled deeply with self. Often it comes after a period of intense emotional engagement when the soul has gone through the fire of relational patterns, childhood wounds, projections, and self betrayals. The detachment is the ash after the burning, the stillness after the storm. It is not something one can force or imitate. It emerges when the psyche has truly integrated what it once externalized. And because it arises naturally, it can feel disorienting. You expect to care as you once did. You expect to feel the sting, the anger, the longing, but you don't. And this absence can be confusing, even painful at first, because identity was once so enmeshed in those reactions. What often goes unacknowledged is how much of our emotional life is tied to identification. We identify with the wounded child within us. We identify with the wastever, the victim, the rebel, the pleaser. These identities generate emotional responses automatically. But when these identities begin to dissolve, not intellectually, but experientially, so too does the emotional charge that sustained them. You find yourself in situations that once activated deep fear or need, and instead you observe them with neutrality. This neutrality is sacred. It is not indifference. It is presence without fusion. It is love without enmeshment. It is the soul witnessing what it no longer needs to be entangled in. In many spiritual and psychological traditions, this state is described as the fruit of discernment, the capacity to distinguish between what arises from one's own unconscious and what belongs to another's process. Without this discernment, we are constantly absorbing, reacting, fixing, defending, or attacking. We become characters in plays we did not write, speaking lines that were written by the trauma of others. But with differentiation, a subtle shift occurs. The same scene can unfold, the same words spoken, the same provocations offered. But the interior landscape does not tremble. There is no matching vibration. You may still see the pain in others, you may still feel compassion, but you no longer lose yourself trying to resolve what is not yours. You no longer abandon yourself to manage the emotional climate of another. This level of detachment also signals a return to the center. When the psyche is no longer scattered by external emotional demands, it returns to itself. It becomes more anchored, less volatile, more inwardly defined. This is not a wall. It is a center of gravity. It is not an escape. It is a homecoming. You feel less need to explain, to justify, to defend. You feel less urgency to change or fix others. You stop measuring your worth by how much pain you can carry for someone else. You stop deriving your identity from being necessary in someone else's storm. And in this return, you find space. You find breath. You find a kind of peace that cannot be achieved through control or approval. Process peace is not always welcomed by others. Those who were once tethered to your reactions may feel abandoned. Those who relied on your emotional participation may accuse you of detachment, coldness, or distance. But these accusations are simply reflections of their own unprocessed dependency. To someone still caught in the throes of projection, your calm can feel like absence. Your clarity can feel like betrayal. But you are not betraying anyone by no longer reacting. You are simply standing in a different place within yourself. A place you had to earn. A place you could not fake. A place that required facing your own shadows, your own needs, your own illusions. There is also grief in this process, the grief of recognizing how much time and energy was spent reacting to what was never really about you. The grief of letting go of identities that were rooted in emotional chaos. The grief of becoming someone who no longer fits in the familiar dynamic. But this grief is clean. It does not bind or poison. It is a release. And through this release, a deeper love becomes possible. A love that does not depend on drama, need, or rescue. A love that can be present without possession. A love that can see the other clearly without losing the self. Emotional detachment as a sign of psychic differentiation is not the end of feeling, it is the beginning of true feeling, unclouded by unconscious entanglement. It is the quiet result of having walked through the inner labyrinth, faced the projections, held the pain, and emerged not harder but more whole. The withdrawal of the shadow from external projection is one of the most essential and difficult stages in the process of psychological growth. At the root of so much human conflict, relational trauma, and inner fragmentation lies the unconscious act of projection. We cast out onto others the parts of ourselves we have not faced, our fears, desires, flaws, instincts, and pain. In doing so, we animate the outer world with our inner conflicts. We see betrayal in a friend because we have not owned the part of us that distrusts or manipulates. We see arrogance in another because we are split off from our own power. We experience rejection in silence because we have not reconciled the wound that expects abandonment. Projection makes the world a mirror, but an unconscious one. It confuses what is ours with what is theirs and binds us into psychological dramas that feel deeply personal, even fated. But the soul, if it is attentive, begins to recognize the pattern. It begins to notice that the same kinds of people keep appearing, the same emotional cycles repeating, the same arguments unfolding. each time with different characters but eerily familiar themes. This is the echo of the shadow in motion. The shadow is not simply the dark side of the personality, it is everything in us that we have exiled into the unconscious, everything we have disowned, moralized against, or pushed away. And as long as it remains hidden, it does not stay quiet. It speaks through projection. It uses others to reflect back to us what we cannot yet hold. This process, while unconscious, is not random. The psyche seeks wholeness. It seeks to restore what has been split off. And projection is one of the earliest ways it attempts to bring the shadow into visibility, though often through conflict, disappointment, and emotional charge. Withdrawal of the shadow from projection is not an intellectual act. It cannot be achieved by simply understanding the theory or recognizing that this is my issue. It requires a direct confrontation with the disowned parts of the self. It requires facing the instinctual drives, the shameful feelings, the irrational fears, the wounded patterns, all of which we would rather see in others than in ourselves. But when this confrontation is sincere, something shifts. The charge begins to diminish. The same behavior in another person no longer provokes the same reaction. What once pulled you into a storm now appears less threatening, less personal, less important. This is not the result of superiority, but of integration. You no longer need the outer world to carry what you are now able to carry within. This withdrawal can be unsettling. It destabilizes the old emotional framework. You may find yourself feeling strangely neutral in situations that once triggered you. You may notice that you no longer have the same impulse to judge, blame, or correct others. The part of you that once projected onto them is no longer reaching outward. It has turned inward, not as a form of withdrawal from life, but as a deeper engagement with your own truth. This can lead to periods of silence, solitude, and introspection. You may become less reactive, less involved in the emotional dramas around you, not because you don't care, but because you now see that those dramas were often projections meeting. Without the unconscious hook, there is no longer a reason to engage. The relationships that were built on mutual projection often cannot survive this shift. When two people are unconsciously using each other to carry disowned aspects of themselves, the relationship is held together by a kind of unconscious contract. You will carry my unacknowledged rage, and I will carry your hidden dependency. You will be the wounded one, so I can feel strong, and I will be the distant one, so you can feel abandoned. When one person begins to withdraw their shadow from the other, this contract begins to dissolve. The balance is disrupted, and unless the other person is also willing to begin their own work of integration, the relationship often enters conflict or falls away. This is not a failure. It is a natural consequence of the soul reclaiming its own contents. What follows can feel like a strange emptiness. The familiar emotional intensity is gone. The urgency to resolve, to fix, to prove disappears. In its place, there may be silence, stillness, even boredom. But beneath this quiet is a different kind of life beginning to stir. It is not the reactive life of emotional projection, but the deeper life of authenticity. You begin to feel what is truly yours, your joy, your grief, your desire, your creativity, all uncolored by the distortions of shadow play. There is less drama, but more truth. There is less performance, but more presence. The withdrawal of projection also brings about a different way of seeing others. You begin to perceive them not as characters in your internal story, but as individuals with their own inner worlds. Compassion deepens, but attachment lessens. You no longer need them to behave a certain way in order to maintain your emotional balance. You are no longer as tempted to mold them into what you need them to be. This is not detachment in the spiritual bypass sense. It is psychological maturity. It allows for love that is clean, respect that is not conditional, and boundaries that are not defensive. This process also changes how you see yourself without the shadow projected outward. You begin to feel the full complexity of your own being. You are no longer simply the victim or the hero, the wise one or the broken one. You are all of it. You hold opposites. You are capable of things you once judged in others. And this recognition, while humbling, is also liberating. It brings you closer to the truth of who you are, not an idealized self image, but a real, grounded presence that includes both light and shadow. You do not need to hide, defend, or attack. You do not need to prove your worth or deny your flaws. You simply are, and that is enough. This state is rare because it is hard won. It requires honesty, courage, and patience. It demands that you turn toward what you once turned away from. It asks that you stop using others to carry what only you can carry. But the reward is freedom, not the kind of freedom that escapes life, but the kind that allows you to meet life without illusion. You are no longer a prisoner of the unconscious. You are no longer playing a role you did not choose. You are no longer moved by forces you do not understand. You are here, present, awake. The shadow is no longer projected. It is seen, owned, and finally integrated.